Before the iPhone, before Android, before smartphones took over the world, there was Motorola. In fact, if you go back far enough, Motorola didn't just compete in mobile phones, they invented it. The very first handheld mobile phone call in history, it was made by a Motorola engineer, and for decades, Motorola was the king of wireless communication. So how does a company go from inventing the mobile phone to nearly disappearing in the smartphone era it helped create? This is the rise and fall of Motorola. Motorola was founded in 1928 in Chicago. Originally, they didn't make phones. They made car radios. In fact, the name Motorola comes from motor and Victrola because they were putting radios inside automobiles. From the beginning, Motorola specialized in communication, police radios, military communications, semiconductors. They built the technology that helped astronauts communicate with Earth during the Apollo missions. Yes, when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, his voice traveled through Motorola technology. Communication was in their DNA. And that DNA led to something revolutionary. In 1973, a Motorola engineer named Martin Cooper made history. He placed the first ever handheld mobile phone call, standing on a sidewalk in New York City, calling a competitor, just to prove it worked. The device was massive, heavy, almost a brick, but it worked. And 10 years later, in 1983, Motorola released the first commercial handheld mobile phone, the DynaTAC. It was expensive, nearly $4,000 at launch, but it symbolized the future. Motorola had created an entirely new industry. Fast forward to the 1990s and early 2000s. Motorola became one of the biggest mobile phone manufacturers in the world. Then came 2004, and one of the most iconic phones ever made, the Razr. Slim, metallic, stylish. The Motorola Razr wasn't just a phone, it was a fashion statement. At a time when most phones were bulky plastic devices, the Razr looked futuristic. It was everywhere. Celebrities had it, teenagers wanted it, executives carried it. Motorola sold over 130 million Razr phones. For a while, they were on top again. The stock price soared, profits surged, they had momentum. But underneath that success, problems were forming. The Razr was a design masterpiece, but Motorola became too dependent on it. Instead of aggressively innovating beyond the Razr, they released variations, slight upgrades, different colors, minor tweaks. Meanwhile, the industry was changing. Phones were no longer just about calls and texts. They were becoming mini computers. And in 2007, everything shifted. In January 2007, Apple unveiled the iPhone, a full touchscreen device, no physical keyboard, no flip design, just a screen and software. And in 2008, Google launched Android. Suddenly, the phone wasn't just hardware, it was an ecosystem. Apps became the center of everything. Developers flocked to iOS and Android. Consumers wanted touchscreens, internet browsing, social media, app stores. Motorola wasn't ready. They had hardware expertise, but they didn't have a competitive software platform. And in the smartphone era, software was king. From 2007 to 2009, Motorola's market share plummeted. The Razr era ended. Competitors surged ahead. The company struggled internally. Leadership changes, strategic confusion, delayed product launches. They eventually adopted Android and released devices like the Droid in partnership with Verizon. For a moment, it looked promising. The Motorola Droid became one of the first serious Android competitors to the iPhone, but it wasn't enough to restore long-term dominance. Samsung scaled faster. Apple dominated the premium market. Chinese manufacturers entered with aggressive pricing. Motorola was squeezed from every direction. In 2011, Motorola split itself into two separate companies. Motorola Mobility, focused on phones. Motorola Solutions, focused on enterprise and communications equipment. Soon after, something dramatic happened. Google acquired Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion. Yes, Google bought Motorola. The company that once invented the mobile phone was now owned by the company that built Android. But even that didn't last. In 2014, Google sold Motorola Mobility to Lenovo. At that point, Motorola was no longer a dominant innovator. It was a brand under new ownership. The king had fallen. But did Motorola really die? Here's the interesting part. Motorola didn't completely disappear. Under Lenovo, the brand continues to produce smartphones today, especially in mid-range markets. They even revived the Razr name with foldable smartphones. Meanwhile, Motorola Solutions, the enterprise side of the company, remains strong, focusing on mission-critical communication systems for governments, emergency services, and corporations. So while the consumer phone empire collapsed, the communication legacy survived. Motorola's fall wasn't about incompetence. It was about timing and adaptation. 3 key mistakes stand out. Over-relying on the Razr instead of building the next big thing. Underestimating the shift from hardware to software ecosystems. Reacting to competitors instead of defining the future. They invented the mobile phone, but they didn't define the smartphone era. And in tech, invention doesn't guarantee dominance. Execution does. Motorola's story is powerful because it shows something uncomfortable. Even pioneers can lose. Even inventors can fall behind. The company that placed the first mobile call in history lost the battle for the modern smartphone. Why? Because industries evolve. And when a platform shift happens, like from flip phones to touchscreens, companies must reinvent themselves completely. Not gradually, but completely. Motorola hesitated. Apple and Android didn't. And that made all the difference. Motorola helped connect astronauts to Earth. They invented the handheld mobile phone. They created one of the most iconic devices of the 2000s. For decades, they shaped how the world communicated. But when the smartphone revolution arrived, they weren't leading it. They were chasing it. And in technology, once you start chasing, it's very hard to catch up. Settings. Add classic Hormozy subtitle. Use only generated clips. Use any voice with a standard Midwestern accent for speaker 2.